To love life is to notice the wonders that abound, and to notice the wonders that abound is to be grounded here and now. And to be grounded here and now is the beginning of finding love for this life today. Let us ground ourselves in this instant in the worship of all things good and right. Our reading today is a poem by Denise Levertov. Don't say there is no water to solace the dryness at our hearts. I have seen the fountain springing out of the rock wall and you drinking there, and I too before your eyes found footholds and climbed to drink the cool water. The woman of that place, shading her eyes, frowned as she watched, but not because she grudged the water, only because she was waiting to see who drank their fill and was refreshed. Don't say there is no water. The fountain is there among its scalloped gray and green stones. It is still there and always there, with its quiet song and strange power to spring in us, up and through the rock.
Hi, I'm Paula Ellis, and I'm not a real human being. At least that seems to be kind of the general consensus in our society and to people that I talk to. People's opinion of me and other transgender people like me, because I am a transgender woman, is that we're not really human beings like they see other people around them as being human beings. I was part of a panel discussion earlier this month at a class in TCU, and one of the students there got many polite questions, but one young man who seemed very nice asked if I felt there should be a law that required transgender people to disclose that we are transgender before they go on a first date with someone, a law. And his reason for this was because we can't reproduce, which is interesting because I have 2 children. But he really went on about it, and he kept asking kind of different variations of the same question. The idea of perhaps dating a woman who is transgender, without knowing it, really bothered this young man, or seemed to. And I get questions like this at many such events that I've attended over the years. People in this state feel it's permissible and perfectly a reasonable topic of conversation to talk about whether somebody like me can use a public bathroom. Our federal government wants to kick people like me out of the military, even though I know many, many transgender veterans who served with great distinction in our military. And as we saw in the video, and this past Monday we celebrated our Transgender Day of Remembrance, 25 people transgender people in America were murdered that we know of just for being transgender, all but one of them transgender women of color. These just are not really discussions that you have about your fellow human beings. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you here today, because what I'm going to talk about may be a little bit challenging, but I know that this congregation is made up of really good people. You're kind and you're loving and you're accepting. And I've talked to some of you, and I'm going to have a hard conversation because I believe that you're people capable of having a conversation like this. So how did we get to this place where we are with transgender people? Why are people like me reviled? Why is love for us as people so seemingly impossible? So I'd like to talk about love for a minute. Brene Brown, who I don't know if you've ever watched her, but she's absolutely wonderful, and she talks a lot about love. She says that we cultivate love when we allow our most vulnerable and powerful selves to be deeply seen and known, when we honor the spiritual connection that grows from that offering with trust, respect, kindness, and affection. She also says that love is not something we give or get. It's something that we nurture and grow, a connection that can only be cultivated between two people when it exists within each of them. We can only love others as much as we love ourselves. So I believe that love is about connection, that it's about communication and trust and vulnerability. Love is about both ourselves and about other people. It's a conversation where we bare our souls to one another. Unfortunately, I can't just talk about love today as much as I would like to. I like talking about love a lot because there's not very much love in the world for transgender people. There's plenty of hate for us, though, and I guess to understand why there isn't love for us, I want to talk about I want to understand hate first and talk about it. So what is hatred? If love is a connection, then it stands to reason that hatred must be a disconnection. If love starts with openness and vulnerability, then it's the opposite. Hate must start with insecurity and defensiveness. If love is rooted in genuine communication, then it stands to reason that hatred must be avoiding that communication. If love is a conversation, and I believe love is a conversation, then hatred is changing the subject to avoid something that we are not emotionally comfortable saying. So what are some of the things that people are uncomfortable talking about? What makes us uncomfortable emotionally? Well, we may fear that others will discover our own misdeeds or shortcomings, and so we project those things, casting them onto others to take attention away from ourselves. We may fear that we're inadequate in some way, and so we denigrate others. We may fear being perceived as different from others, or fear those different from ourselves, and so we ostracize others. We may fear that our cherished beliefs might not actually be perfectly true, and so we become dogmatic. We may fear confronting our own identity, so we deny the identities of others. We don't like to talk about things that we're afraid of, and these things I mentioned are very scary things emotionally to talk about, at least they are for me. We're taught that fear is weakness, and weakness is bad, vulnerability is bad. We have defenses against bad feelings, and we use them, and we change the subject. So I'd like to point out that the kind of hatred I'm talking about isn't just like murder or Westboro Baptist Church hatred or KKK kind of hatred. That's really extreme. When I'm using the word hate here today, I'm really talking about the things that make it impossible to love, the things that occlude love, that block it out of existence. It's a lot more subtle, but the thing is that the things that stop love, in the long run, can become hatred very easily. And indeed, it's the more subtle sort of manifestations of not loving others that really create most of the trouble that transgender people face in the world, and in the extreme cases that we pay for with our lives. Our culture is transphobic, and transphobia really means hatred of transgender people. We're steeped in it from a really early age. It's one of the things, this hatred is one of the things that makes coming out as a transgender person very difficult to do for many of us. It seems that hard to imagine, but the truth is, I'm going to tell you that in my experience, the distance from those questions that otherwise pleasant-seeming young man asked in the class that I attended, the distance from that to murdering a transgender woman of color is much shorter than you would ever possibly imagine. What I'd like to talk about is, the reasons for that. Why What are the emotions behind this? How do we get here? And what I really think is the issue and what makes people uncomfortable and charges these negative feelings that some people seem to have is that there are some difficult questions that transgender people bring to mind just inevitably by our existence, and these are things that we're not used to talking about. So sometimes we look different, and sometimes we sound differently than other people. We judge each other based on appearances very often in our society and as people. It's a natural thing, and we all do it. We raise really fundamental questions about what it means to be a man or a woman in our society, or indeed that being a man or a woman are the only options in our society, because that's not really the case. Our society has really deep assumptions that only men and women exist, and that those characteristics are indelible and immutable on our character from birth. This is a thing that until recently was never even discussed because it was just universally given as a truth. We raise questions about what defines gender or even biological sex. And the last one may seem, pretty unambiguous, what's biological sex, but the truth is that our idea of sex, that there's men and women, male and female, is a social construction. In point of fact, there are several million people in America who are intersex, who have characteristics that really mean that they're neither male or female exactly. Millions of people, okay, that are like this. But when you tell that to people, and I've done this many times, they go, oh, well, that's just rare and it doesn't matter. Millions of people, okay? The population of like Dallas and Fort Worth would be about like intersex, all of the intersex people in the United States. That's a lot of people to just wave our arms and go, oh, that doesn't matter. It very much matters, but they say it doesn't because emotionally they don't want to deal with the idea that this notion they have in their head is not really true. As people, we are kind of hierarchical. We have our place in society, and it's very often defined by things like race or class or education or gender. So what does it mean to society if someone changes their perceived gender? People very often have this idea of a social order, and suddenly that's all up in the air. I would point out, though, that in the entire history of the world, the existence of transgender people, and we've existed through all history, has yet to end a single civilization yet. So if you're worried, if that's your worry, then please rest assured, we'll be fine. We're not really encouraged, and I think this one is a big one, we're not encouraged as a society to really know ourselves and know who we are as human beings. We're encouraged a lot to conform to what society says we need to be. We're encouraged to conform in ways that are useful. But I can tell you for myself that, and other transgender people I know, we really very often spend a great deal of our energy learning who we are, because trying to pretend to be what the world said we are, in my case, was literally killing me. Had I not come to know who I truly am and to deeply explore who I am, and I'm by no means assume that I'm done, this is an ongoing journey for me, I'm very certain that I would have perished and not be standing here before you today. We have no choice but to explore who we are, and that doesn't go down so well, I think, in our society. Sometimes we define ourselves in society by what we do as opposed to who we are. Women give birth and nurse babies. Men father children. Well, trans people violate these rules. And if your self-image hangs on physical things like that, characteristics like that, you're going to have a hard time accepting that trans people are legitimate because it invalidates your sense that you're legitimate. people in relationships with others often define themselves in part by those other relationships. This is something that I see in my work with my group a lot. You're so-and-so's spouse, or you're such and such's friend. We, and some of us, find strong identity in who we're associated with. Well, if someone that you're closely associated with radically changes, as certainly happens with many of us who transition our gender, your identity itself may also come into question, and that is a very hard thing to deal with. And it is a significant source of grief that I see in spouses of transgender people. We make discussions about sexuality and sexual orientation, which are things that our society is frankly terrible about discussing overall, vastly more complicated, just by our nature. We raise questions, what does it mean? For that young man I mentioned earlier, he could not resolve the notion, for instance, that I'm a woman, and I'm way too old for someone like him, but that a woman like me who is, say, young enough could be someone that he could be attracted to. He couldn't resolve that in his mind, and that profoundly bothered him, and that bothers a lot of men. That's one of the leading reasons that transgender women of color in particular are murdered, is that men who are attracted to them then begin to feel conflicted feelings over what that even means. It just means they're a man who loved women, by the way. But that's not what they see in their minds, and their response is sometimes awful and violent. So, through no real fault of our own, we just bring up a truckload of issues that most of us don't want to talk about. We don't want to think about them. They're issues we've just kind of been told are givens, and we become emotionally uncomfortable when the subjects are even broached. So when we're uncomfortable with the subject, what do? We change the subject. Honestly believe that a lot of the isolation and ostracism that transgender people face are because that people that they're in relationships with find it easier to sort of bury them in their hearts and minds and treat them as though they've died than to confront the issues that their transition brings. And the relationship withers and dies as a result, and ostracism typically follows. It's an emotional defense, but it's one that's not helpful to anyone in this case. Another reaction, and one I mentioned, is to dehumanize people who make us feel uncomfortable. Now, I believe we dehumanize people because, hey, if something that's not human is upsetting you, you don't have to take it so seriously. You don't have to take it to heart. You can avoid the subject because, hey, it's not human. So some examples of this that transgender people face. Danica Rome, who is a delegate in the Virginia State House now, who historically won an election there, is referred to in the press almost universally as the transgender candidate. Not named, Danica Rome, new delegate in Virginia. She's the transgender lawmaker. We get prurient questions about our bodies. We are sexually fetishized. We're very often treated as though we're mentally ill, and part of that is because we almost instantly dehumanize mentally ill people in our culture. I can't tell you the number of people that have told me that I should see a psychologist because I'm obviously insane and don't know who I am. The irony is that I've spent hundreds of hours with psychologists to figure out exactly who I am, way better than the person saying that to me. Our existence is denied based on some physical trait that people self-identify with. There's endless jokes about us on TV or in movies. There's a refusal from many people to treat our gender identity as real, using the wrong names, the wrong pronouns, very often even refusing to give us the dignity of burial under our chosen name at our death. Even in death, we don't get dignity sometimes. Ostracizing us because we make you uncomfortable, trying to ban us from public existence has happened this spring here in Texas, denial of medical care, and murder. So almost all of us who are transgender face some form of dehumanization like this. Not all of it or all the time, or this wouldn't be survivable, but it's routine. It's in the media. It's perpetuated by people we meet, even people who don't know that we're necessarily transgender. So you might, at this point, be saying to yourself, because you're good people, that, well, that couldn't possibly be me. I accept everybody. I love everybody. And, I know that I am very unlikely to find a kinder group of people than the people sitting out there, all of you today. I've talked to many of you, and you are wonderful to a person. But I hate to tell you that it's most likely the case that you hold some of these attitudes that dehumanize trans people. Our society really is steeped in these ideas. I mean, we're soaking in it. We're taught these things from an early age, and they're just unquestioned most of the time, beliefs about gender and sexuality. Some of really, truly powerful allies that I've met of the transgender community, people that I am genuinely grateful to for their work, have once in a while expressed some of these attitudes. I have a friend, for instance, who, a brilliant woman, and she managed to convert discussion about civil rights for LGBT people, which can be a hard sell in this state, into an economic argument that it was good for business to not have discriminatory laws against LGBT people. I mean, that's a really brilliant way to sidestep and circumvent all of these emotional issues. She short-circuited the whole thing. It's brilliant. Except when she talked to me about it, I pointed out to her, and I was very nervous about pointing this out to her because I really love this woman. She is a dear friend. That really doing this, as clever and as useful as it was, and it really did help save us from having some awful laws passed against us this year in our legislature, that it wasn't ultimately going to change anything because avoiding the issue is the entire problem. People don't want to face these issues. They don't want to learn to accept us in their hearts. And so bypassing this just kicks the issue down the road. It doesn't fix anything. And she was absolutely flabbergasted when I pointed out, yeah, the problem is people don't think we're human beings, and until that changes, we can stop all the laws or pass protective laws, but our world won't change until people just see us as being people. This astounded her. And I would say, because I don't want to pick on you because I'm standing up here and you can't answer me back, look, I've had these attitudes and I've had to fight them within myself. I'm not trying to say that I'm better than you somehow because I'm transgender and magically don't have these attitudes. Almost all of the transgender people I know have absorbed these same attitudes, negative attitudes that are prevalent in our society about ourselves, and we struggle with these, and like I said, I spent a lot of time in therapy working on this, and I feel very certain I'm still not done. And so I say these things to you, but I say them equally to myself. I'm not, pointing the finger at you so much. So, I think our challenge here is to not change the subject and to actually have these hard conversations, to face the assumptions that are untrue, and to be willing to have these talks. And it's not just about transgender issues. I mean, it's everything. It's racial that matters. It's gender matters. It's sexuality matters. We have to be willing to have these conversations because I truly believe that the only path to love is through conversation, through being vulnerable, through being open, and that means being willing to talk about stuff that's uncomfortable sometimes. So, what kinds of things can you do to show love for transgender people if you are so inclined? Well, you can believe in our identities and respect them when we tell you what they are. Listen to us when we talk about our issues, and so I thank you for doing that here today. Educate yourselves. Don't rely on us to be your sole source of information about the trans community, because not all of us are in an emotional place to do that work, and it can be very exhausting work. Advocate us for politically and with people in your daily life, because they will hear you. Many people who aren't transgender will hear those of you who aren't transgender in a way they will never listen to me. They may feel I'm mentally ill or defective in some way, or that I just have an agenda. And my agenda is just being treated like a normal person, but, some agenda, but that's what they think. They'll listen to you and they won't listen to me, no matter how well I might say it. Look at the things around you in the world and notice anything that you use on a daily basis and ask if they have a policy that's helpful for transgender people, because literally almost everything in the world is broken for us. Medical things, job things, political things, almost everything. There are so few things that aren't touched by gender in our society. It's surprising. But if you can do none of those things, and look, advocating for us is a really big ask. I understand that. But if you can do none of those things, I would ask that you do one thing, and this is by far the most important thing, and if you take nothing else away from my speech today, please do this. Look for the attitudes I've mentioned, the assumptions about gender, about identity, things, sexuality, things you've never really thought about, and think about those things deeply, and look for attitudes within yourself that make you feel different than transgender people. Recognize those attitudes for what they are. Things that make you change the subject away from love to something else so that you don't have to deal with them. Have the hard conversations and embrace love. This is by far the most important thing you can do for us, and if that can spread through the world, that's what will change it for us. And so, thank you.